Um, our next session is an hour-long discussion with as I say, an all-star A-list panel. And I'm going to introduce the moderator.
Okay, that's you.
And I will tell you that I was so excited about two and a half years ago when Stuart and I were planning the 2018 Asimov Symposium to discover that we had a Nobel, Nebula Prize-winning author just over the mountain. Maybe a Nobel Prize too at some point, Andy. Who knows? Maybe science fiction, as it gains traction and gets more respect, maybe the Nobel Prize is on the horizon. But a Nebula award winner just over the mountain at Frostburg. And Andy was very kind to come to WVU and deliver a great lecture. And it was a wonderful combination, that lecture he gave in 2018, talking about Asimov and the golden era of science fiction, but then also moving us up through to the present day and talking about more diverse voices. And he mentioned Octavia Butler in particular. And I think that it was a wonderful and important set of remarks for the occasion, and delighted to hear it then, and delighted that he has come to moderate our final session here this afternoon. Andy is, in addition to winning a Nebula Award, a 3-time winner of the World Fantasy Award, an instructor at Clarion and Clarion West. He is a member of the faculty at Frostburg State, but perhaps most relevant to this conversation, he was a Theodore Sturgeon Memorial Award winner, and that award is given by the Gunn Center for the Study of Science Fiction at the University of Kansas. And so how serendipitous it is that we have a Sturgeon Award winner, Andy Duncan, to talk and lead a discussion with 3 representatives from the Gunn Center at the University of Kansas. And let me say, Andy, just before I turn it over to you, to Jim and to Chris, whom I've met before when they came here in 2010, it's an honor and a delight to be with you virtually on this occasion. And Kij, it's wonderful to meet you virtually, and I look forward to meeting you in person sometime very soon. So thank you all very much for coming. And to my friend Jim, it's just a pleasure and a privilege to be with you on this session. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Andy, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Jay. The floor will not be mine for long, nor the walls or the ceiling either, because Jim and Kij and Chris have plenty to say and plenty of knowledge and experience about the Gunn Center and everything else. And Jim Gunn, just all by himself, is a walking history of our field, and not just science fiction writing, but all of science fiction in the academy and on the campuses and in library collections like the Eaton. Jim was part of so many of those movements through the years, and in a very real sense, we are all here in this virtual space on this afternoon because of Jim Gunn and all the things he worked so hard to do at a time when it was when it wasn't so easy to get a university president to show up and give introductory remarks at a science fiction event, let's face it. But in my own defense on that Nobel Prize thing, or in Kij's defense, I think she's more likely to get that Nobel than me, at least in literature. And she already has more nebulas than I do. Right. She already has a lot more nebulas than I do also. I've lost track. But we should introduce everybody. Because Jim Gunn is here, Kij Johnson is here, and Chris McKitterick is here. Let's start with Chris. Chris, give us the capsule panel introduction to who you are and what you do with the Gun Center and how long you've been associated.
Oh, okay. Well, so I'm the director of the Gun Center for the Study of Science Fiction at University of Kansas. I got involved back in 1992, actually. I came to the summer science fiction writing workshop that Jim used to offer on his own with special guests, usually for the first week, sometimes, for more. And I had been living in Montana for the year prior to that. And before that had finished undergrad program with creative writing, psychology, education, and astrophysics studies. So, I spent some time as an undergrad. But I knew I wanted to be a writer. I never intended to actually work in academia. But applying for this workshop, I was just starting to sell some things. But I knew I needed to learn some more. And Jim was this, grandmaster of science fiction, right? So applied to his workshop with another friend of mine who we had been doing sort of online correspondence back in the early 90s. Remember how those bulletin boards worked? You'd get sort of a message saying somebody had posted. That was how the workshop had worked back then, just randomly. But Jim did this amazing 2-week intensive workshop. And so I was going to meet this friend I'd been exchanging manuscripts with for a couple of years and learn from the master. And then Frederick Pohl was going to be a special guest that year. And I thought, man, you can't beat that. And when I applied, and probably was like January or something like that for the summer, Jim accepted me and asked if I was going to be, what was I going to be doing, right? I was living in northeastern Montana in a town of 50 people, teaching at the K through 12 and writing tons. And I was like, I'm not sure. And he said, well, I'm retiring after this year. So if you would like to study more with me, maybe you should apply for grad school here. And that's how I got involved in graduate studies. And then got roped in from there to, let's see. I guess first I helped develop the website, the center's website, which at the time had been a couple of pages created by his son, Kevin. And now it's hundreds, I don't know, maybe thousands of pages and many thousands of other kinds of files and images and so forth. Then I helped bring back the Sturgeon Award, which had been, at that time, Orson Scott Card's Review magazine had been in charge for a few years. And so I helped set up the new nomination process and finding jurors to be able to do that. Handed that off to Kij a while ago. And then she handed off to one of our soon-to-be PhD graduates who will probably continue. I'm sure we've got him hooked at this point. And then when I graduated, moved to Seattle, worked in gaming and in technical writing and worked at Microsoft and did that for about 6 years. But I spent my summer vacations helping with the workshop with Jim and with the Teaching Institute. And then in 2002, I was recruited by the university to come get involved. And once I got here, then Jim quickly handed things more and more over until I became the director in 2010.
What?
Pretty much, right?
Okay.
So that's how I got it.
I think that's often how things always happened in science fiction and in academia also.
It's like a bottle imp.
Yes, you express an interest and all the stuff lands on your desk eventually. Kij, tell us about some of the things that are on your desk and about the stuff you're involved in.
Well, I came to the center much later, of course. And in fact, I came to academia quite late. I got my bachelor's degree in history and said, never again. You could not pay me to go to grad school. And so for the next 30 years, I did everything but. I worked in gaming and comic books, science fiction publishing, tech. I worked in tech for a little while, and eventually decided that I wanted to be able to teach creative writing and fantasy. I didn't realize that my particular level of nerdery was not going to be specific to 21st century students. It turns out they're not as interested in William Hope Hodgson as I had hoped. But yes, I ended up getting a graduate degree at North Carolina State University, Andy's and my alma mater, actually, and came back to the University of Kansas. I'd been involved with the center since 1994 when I won the Sturgeon, which was a big surprise to me. And then I was involved at various levels every year after that, really. So gradually it's been sort of like boiling the frog. I started out with just a couple of things, and at this point, I'm still managing the Sturgeon Award, although my Jason Baltazar is doing most of the work these days, and still doing an awful lot of work for our summer science fiction program because we have residential programs here. So that's kind of what I'm doing these days, if that answers your question.
It
Hey, Kish,
does.
I have a follow-up for that
Um,
one, Kish. So I would like you to talk a little bit about how you discovered about the Sturgeon Award, because
This would segue straight into introducing Jim, because in 1994, I just came for a couple of days because of a friend who had enjoyed it, enjoyed the summer workshops, which the banquet where they gave the Sturgeon Award was at was the culmination of. And I didn't plan on staying for the banquet, and had every plan and was obdurate about leaving before the banquet. And finally, Jim took me into his office and said, well, you're winning the Sturgeon this year. And it's as well, because if I had not been informed ahead of time, I would have passed out. So I'm glad he did.
Thank you.
Jim.
Jim, I hardly know where you should start.
Well,
Oh,
I'll start at the beginning. How about that?
please do.
Okay, it's good to hear your voice, Andy, and see all the people
Well,
that I
and you
met when I was
likewise.
there, and to see the wonders of the Asimov collection, which is one of the marvels, the eighth marvel of the world, I think. But to get back to the story of the center, it is perhaps a coincidence, but has an odd relevance that actually this symposium is being held on the 50th anniversary of the first science fiction class that I taught. I had been the founding director of university relations at the university by chance, which is another story. And before that, for a couple of years, the editor of alumni publications. And before that, when we moved back to Lawrence, where we graduated, my wife and I, because we liked it better, and particularly she liked it better, place to live, I was fully intended to go on with a writing career, but I stopped in to talk to the chair of the English department, and he'd offered me a job before I went out the door of teaching a couple of classes. I suspect motivated as much as anything else by the fact that he was short of teachers and grabbed at anybody who came in the door. But before the semester was over, I got a call to go see him, a man named Jim Wortham, and he said that the director of the alumni magazine was looking for some editorial help. And I went over and got invited to hold that job. It all went up to spending 10 years in the service of getting the story of the university out to its many followers and their message perhaps back to the administration. But I had decided that I had spent enough time in this particular venture, and I wasn't doing anything extra or unusual that anybody couldn't have done. And anything I wrote, I was putting other people's names on, and I wanted to go write my own work. So I asked the English department if they would be willing to take me as a full-time teacher it turned out I was teaching a course a year in fiction writing, so I was known then. And one day, afternoon day in 1970, the chair of the department, George Worth, came and talked to my office and said that the teaching faculty had voted unanimously that they would like me to join them. And he added significantly in terms of this topic, they added, some younger members of the department hope you will be willing to teach a course in science fiction, which was revealing to me and a really unusual occurrence in academia at the time, because in most places it was very difficult to get a job or even a single class teaching science fiction. And here I was being invited to give this class. And that was in 1970, 50 years ago. I spent the summer actually writing my lectures. And it turned out that this was the beginning of my academic career as well, since an editor for Prentice Hall, made a trip through the University of Kansas that spring, and he asked me if I'd be willing to write a textbook on fiction writing. And I said, well, I didn't know that much about that, but I had these lectures that might make a good book. And I gave him the lectures, and he called back a month later and said that he couldn't use it as a textbook. He tried it on some teachers there, and none of them are interested. But what would I think about a lavishly illustrated coffee table book? And that began my publications in the academic side of science fiction. It wasn't the first class in 1970, but of the field. There was a new formal class taught at Colgate, I believe. 4 years earlier, Jack Williamson began teaching for that period in eastern New Mexico, and Tom Clarison had been publishing a journal, extrapolation, and at Worcester. And a couple of years later, he presided over a meeting in New York, I think at Fordham University, and just to show the fact that this was not a ideal world in which to teach science fiction. There were some fans who went to this meeting at Fordham in the classroom, one of whom was Dina Brown, the then wife of Charlie Brown, who had his own magazine and later refined it to become Locus. But during this meeting, Dina Brown went to a blackboard and wrote, "Let's take science fiction out of the classroom and put it back in the gutter where it belongs." And there was some significant opposition among writers and longtime fans of science fiction that here was this academic people who were interested in taking over what had originally been only fandom. And so the career after 1970 that I participated in and perhaps had a meaningful connection with had its start then with all of these things going on, and gradually as my career there went on, and I not only wrote about science fiction, I was writing science fiction as well. and things began to happen that were indications that science fiction was becoming more popular. There were, my first class, for instance, I had 165 students, and I teach a science fiction class after that about once a year, and it always had over 100 for a while. It finally settled down to about 50. And I was writing texts about science fiction as I explored my own reaction to science fiction, and got tips and instructions and assets from writers like Isaac Asimov, and had the advantage really in my position of not only teaching science fiction and fiction writing, but also participating in the culture itself. I had attended my first science fiction convention, world convention, in 1952. And there I got my first introduction to what it was like to be part of a group, part of what turned out to be an action group, but the action was all pretty much individual. And the Science Fiction Research Association was born during this early period and began holding regular meetings. I had been elected president of the Science Fiction Writers of America, now Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America, early in my academic career. And I began getting letters from teachers saying, I've been assigned to teach this course in science fiction. What do I teach? And I soon began getting the idea that maybe we could provide a summer institute, what I try to call the Intensive English Institute on the teaching of science fiction, and began getting, every summer I would present this 3-week institute that covered mostly the history of the writing of science fiction and how it came about, which really supported my own teaching, which was what is science fiction? How do we distinguish it? How did it get started? And how has it changed since then? And that was what I was teaching, basically the history of science fiction, which I thought, from my own experience, students really needed and were able to understand science fiction better if they knew where it came from and the people who had contributed to it. And one of the things I think that's still missing in the science fiction field is an understanding of those things that to me are essential to good reading of science fiction and an understanding of it and how it differs from other kinds of literature. I also had within the university, I had an invitation to team teach a course in futurism, to which we brought in Frederick Pohl as a guest speaker. And it too indicated a broad interest in the field within the university itself. And I got connected with academic ends of the publishing field. I had the unusual experience as a teacher of not only knowing most of the writers from the conventions that I had attended, and mostly, and the SFRA meetings that I attended. And it was shortly after that, elected president of the SFWA as well. I'm sorry, the president of the SFRA, the Research Association. And so my knowledge of the field and acquaintance with the field began spreading out more broadly, probably than most teachers. and you have the experience of being a writer and dealing with writers and would-be writers, and presumably in your travel around, you have a chance to get acquainted with other members of the field. But it's unusual. It certainly was unusual then for somebody who had this kind of affiliation and acquaintance in the field. One of whom was Isaac Asimov, and on later equations, A. E. Van Vogt and Robert Heinlein. But of them all, Isaac was the most helpful in that he always answered his mail. He always used a postcard mostly, but
That,
moment
that's
he got,
unusual among science fiction writers.
yeah, the moment he got one of my letters, I would write at length. He would respond with a postcard, and I eventually got embarrassed by taking him away from his prolific writing to correspond with an insignificant author and teacher off there in Lawrence, Kansas. So I stopped writing until years later. I gave a lecture on science fiction, illustrated from my pictures that I had used in alternate worlds. And we had dinner with Isaac and Janet, and the director of the Hayden Planetarium. But as I was saying goodbye to him just before I came down sick with pneumonia, but I told him I had stopped writing because I was feeling guilty about taking his time away when he was always writing. So it was difficult. But he said to me in a very thankful manner, he said, "You can write me anytime you want to." And then I came down with pneumonia, and shortly after that he got sick. So we didn't really correspond much. But I have in my file some interesting insights into what Isaac was interested in, and what he did to engage his writing. I won't tell any of those now, but you can find some of them in my autobiography. But in the midst of all this, and the interest within the university itself, and the attendance at the courses, and the various kinds of invitations I was getting to speak to other venues and within the university, and to participate in other people's classes, and to get them occasionally to help out mine. I began, and were also engaged in some other activities, such as doing a film study of current writers about various aspects of what they were doing, and I planned to make it a full series of something like 18 or 20 films. I ended up with 11 or 12 featuring Isaac and Fred Pohl and Gordon Dixon and the British writers, and it was all got another award for that. But we eventually ran out of steam, I guess, and resources, and we weren't able to complete a full film course. But the many people have used these films for their own teaching and learning purposes. And so, and with all of the collections that we were doing, I decided that we needed an organization to bring them all together. And I proposed to the English department that I create a center for the study of science fiction. And they said, fine. And we drew up an application and went through the dean, and then went to the Board of Regents and was approved. And I'll let you in on a secret about it that it's not a secret, but a lot of people don't realize it because it's called the Gun Center, but it's really named for my parents, J. Wayne Gunn and Elsie Mae Gunn, Center for the Study of Science Fiction. And as part of that, we brought in the Institute as a significant portion of it, and subsequent to that, a writer's workshop that I spent most of my summers after its creation teaching these two sections of the writer's workshop and the intensive institute on the teaching of science fiction and operations, which thankfully, when I began involved with, got too difficult to maintain a 6 weeks teaching session, and I was needed more at home. So I was fortunate to have two people like Chris McKitterick and Kidge Johnson, after she got inducted with her winning of the Sturgeon Award, and became themselves teachers, and finally took over the summer program in their entirety with the help of visiting writers like you and Pat Cadigan and John Kessel. Reminds me that one of the things that told me that there was time for something like the center, and as far as I know, it was the first organization of its kind, although there are at least half a dozen others for which we provided an occasion to meet at the Campbell Conference and discuss the ways in which we could cooperate and enhance each other's actions. But the center was the first of them. And one of the other indications that it was time was when I got visiting writers like John Kessel to come to the university to actually do graduate work and get his PhD in English on the basis in his thesis of a book full of science fiction stories, one of which had won its first Nebula Award. So, and subsequently, of course, Chris McKitterick came to do steady work, and I already had within the university taking courses already, Brad Denton and Pat Cadigan, two of the authors who became significant figures in the field and have won awards of their own. So in a sense, that's how the center got started. And today it's gone far beyond anything that I could have done on my own. I was fortunate to have not only Chris and Kidge, but their ability to enlist volunteers from the student body and other parts of the university to participate and help out, something that I was never able to do, I think, except as they fell into my lap with coming there to take courses. But today it's a far different operation than it was when I was trying to do it all on my own. And I'm really gratified. What?
Andy?
Yeah.
No, I just, yes?
Yes.
I was just going to say that I think this is a testament to Jim, to how much you inspire people, how much you quietly sat in your office there and suggested, it would be nice if we could do this, and it would be nice if we
yeah,
could do that. Next thing you
yeah.
know,
Well,
people are devoting their lives to
I,
like
I,
keeping this thing going, and it's
I
a
think I was,
remarkable community that y'all have created there.
I was one of the few people who was willing to devote that much time to teaching, writing, and teaching science fiction. So it was and it's really been a privilege and a far more meaningful than I perhaps thought it was. I just got a letter a few days ago from a former summer workshop student who was thanking me for contributing as much as I did to her writing and career. And it's not uncommon to get that kind of a letter. So it's good to know at this time of my life that people are still remembering and benefiting from something that I said or did. And incidentally, I was thinking about it in my book, which I finally got around to writing, The Science of Science Fiction Writing. I had a student who was a dean at Michigan State University, I think, who was there for the writing part of it. And she surprised me a few months after she left by sending her notes of the things I had said during the summer workshop. And I wrote to her and said, could I publish these? I won't have to think them all up again. And she sent me her notes. And if you're still interested in what passed for wisdom at the time, you can read them as an appendix in the Science of Science Fiction Writing.
They really are kind of wonderful because it is, I think it's only about 14 pages, and it is sort of all of the facts with every single piece of dross removed. It is nothing but gold. There's no unnecessary articles. There's no sentences that lead you up to anything. It is just solid, good instructions for writers.
Well, thank you. It's I keep always thank her for her good note taking and for her willingness to share them. But because although I repeat these things basic out of memory and bring them up at the appropriate time, or what seemed the appropriate time, I don't always remember to do that, and it's good to have an external memory to look at if I want to.
I know some of my students former students will say things that strike me as really good, and I say, that's really good.
Yeah.
And I quote you, and they say, well, we heard that from you to begin with. I just didn't remember saying it.
Yeah.
Chris,
One of the things that just to give an example, I often tell students is write it twice. It doesn't get started until you start rewriting. That may not be your motto, but I have always believed that good writing lies in revision.
By the way, I should mention something about Jim.
I do indeed.
That
yes,
pretty much every science fiction teacher in the English-speaking world, and some beyond there, learned from Jim or from one of Jim's students or one of Jim's students' students. He's one of the biggest influence in the field, especially of academic science fiction. That if you are working in the field of science fiction, you have Jim Gunn to thank in large part. I mean, for one thing, the center is the first such place in the world, research center in science fiction.
Yeah, you brought to my attention what one of your attendants here, that since you were a student of John Kessel's and John was a student of mine, that we had created a chain of
Does
teaching that
does
made,
that mean does that mean that Andy is my nephew?
actually, yes, it
I
does.
think it does. Andy's my nephew, so you
Yes.
could be a little more respectful, Andy. I'm just gonna.
Yeah.
I think that ship is sailed.
Yeah. And Andy's one great
I think
asset.
it's too late.
Andy's one great asset is that he is a local writer, in the sense that he has the voice of his place of origin, and it's unusual in a writer to have somebody have that kind of voice of his area. I put my own stamp on the fact that in my early career, at least, and maybe through much of it, that I placed my stories in the place in Kansas City where I grew up, or in Lawrence where I lived. And if people want a geography lesson along with their story, you can find it in my writing, which is my claim, I guess, to a certain amount of originality, although I think all writers tend to incorporate some aspect of their acquaintance in the stories. I did it because it was a lot easier than making it up.
By the way, also, relevant.
Well, I think it's such a wonderful community that has grown up around the gun center, with all the workshops and the returning people every year. And I wondered if Chris and Kij and Jim could speak a little about how maintaining that community has gone in 2020, in the pandemic year. What measures have y'all taken to keep things going?
Chris?
Well, okay, so yeah, we have that. I mean, among the many things that we do with the center, and that we've expanded things since Kish and I, became directors as well, was I started putting together first mailing lists and then online communities. Like, basically, we use Google Groups for most things. We have Facebook groups and things like that. But there's a larger group that we have called the Young Guns, with two N's, obviously, in honor of our patron hero, Jim. And it's everybody who is alums of all of our programs. So right now it's several hundred people, I think, on that list. But then each year for our writing workshops, both Kish and I have yearly groups that we create. Those people, this year, I think 4 or 5 of those previous year groups have been checking in on a regular basis, partly for support, partly to try and encourage one another, just to check in. I usually, after my workshops, I have for the year following each workshop, I have progress reports. I give people assignments after the workshop's over, and ask them to check in with what they've been doing, what they've been writing and reading. Have they submitted things? Have they published things? And what I have found is that it's been super effective in getting people, because writers tend to do their thing on their own. That's the way it works. You can't really write in a group unless you're putting on your headphones in a coffee shop. And so that kind of ongoing support, as well as just knowing other people have got your back, and that you have a responsibility to check in. And boy, let me tell you, some people, that's all they need to get some things submitted. This year, I was very proud of one guy who's been coming to the workshops now for, I think, 15 years. Submitted his first stories professionally outside of, small press, and has now submitted 3 stories this year. Anyway, so that sort of thing. During this year, it's been especially difficult to, for a lot of people to write. Other people are just immersing themselves in writing because of the whole, quarantine 2020. And I tell you, there's nothing that warms a teacher's heart more than hearing about successes. I'm sure, as everybody here who's a teacher can attest to. And just the last check-in that I saw last week, I guess. Let's see, we had a novel and 10 or 12 stories and some poetry. A new magazine launched, all these things published in the group of alums who are checking in. And it really is, it's heartening, especially when everything else in the whole world is just kind of rough. This ongoing community sometimes is kind of difficult to maintain, because now I have a dozen annual groups that check in on a regular basis, plus the larger group. And I'm starting to regret my decision to have all those groups, because I expect to keep doing this for a while. But on the other hand, the reward of seeing all those happy reports on how people are doing. And also this year, it's been a lot of personal stuff. Everybody, I'm sure, has been suffering in various ways. And so it's nice to feel connected to somebody if you can't actually see anybody.
I might mention, incidentally, that I always tried to compact learning experiences, probably taken from the fact that I studied, had an intensive course in Japanese during World War II, which wasn't particularly successful in my case. I dropped out after 4 months, but I get a taste of the intensive active learning. And so when I created the first Intensive English Institute, it was 3 hours of teaching in the morning and 3 hours in the afternoon, and then evening activities. And we did that for 3 weeks straight. And I remember telling people when they asked how the students responded, I said, well, the first year they said, why didn't we find out about this earlier? And the second week, they said, why are you working us so hard? And the third week they said, you mean it's over already? And I think that's one experience that you get from something you like and something that you really get the time to dig into and dive into and spend your waking hours. and out of that, those first groups that we had, one case we had 21 teachers, and others would have 16, 18, sometimes lower. But a lot of them went on to become full-time teachers and very successful.
So Jim is talking about our workshops, and I as well, and the Institute in the summer. So among the various things the center does is in the summertime, we have a month-long residential program that now we rent a scholarship hall on campus. We used to do dorms, and a few people I've noticed in this in this list remember those days. But now we have an entire building to ourselves. So Kish teaches her workshop, which I'd like to hear a little bit about. I do my workshop, and then both of us have what we call our repeat offenders workshops for the people who've already taken our workshop, sometimes multiple times, to come back and work on sort of advanced things, as well as just to be a little bit more informal. And in mine, for example, we do a lot of developmental work as opposed to just critiquing, and other times we'll just sit around and talk about writing technique and stuff. But what I have noticed is that the majority of the people who come to my repeat offenders workshops tend to be people who have also come to my regular workshop. So they're there for a full month. Not quite as intensely as what's Jim's talking about with the Institute, which I still offer. This summer I did that one online. We had people from around the world, so it kind of actually worked better to have it online. So somebody in Germany and England and and here. So people live there, they get up in the morning, usually get together in their sort of common room, write, go to lunch together. In the afternoons, we do our workshops. Mine usually runs till like 5 or 6. Then we typically go out to dinner and continue our conversation, come back from dinner, sometimes watch movies or shows, or just sit around talking or playing, word games, and go to bed and repeat, for a month. And it is the best month of my life. It's what I look forward to every year. It's what keeps me going through whatever happens the rest of the year. And for a lot of these folks who come back, it's a big part of their lives as well. And there's something about that intensive quality that really, it's like boot camp, right? Except without people yelling at you. And people come out of it with sort of that completely immersed in science fiction and speculative fiction writing and concepts of spec fic. Come out educated like what would take basically a year in regular types of courses, because it is all day, every day. And Andy has been a part of that for a number of years himself. So Kish, what's your
It's a great thing.
Yeah, I guess what we're doing on my side is a novel workshop, but it's largely developmental because honestly, getting people to read, most of the time people write a novel and they don't know what they're doing, and it's very productive for them to have thought it through structurally before they really get going. So for us, it's much more developmental and brainstorming. It's a smaller group usually. And we work for days while
because you froze a little bit there. I'm hearing you on Jim's mic though.
One of the things that I wanted to remark upon, and I forgot, was the fact that this 50
his
years,
group is off. Lol again.
50 years of teaching, the field itself was changing. Science fiction was becoming far more mainstream. The writers were becoming far more diverse. The editors became less particular and sticking to genre rules, and the interplay between fantasy and science fiction became more commonplace, and there was more difficulty in telling them apart. In my first edition of Alternate Worlds, for instance, I ended up saying that I thought that science fiction was going to become more like mainstream fiction, and mainstream fiction is becoming more like science fiction. And I think in general that's true. And this whole field has become far more diverse and far hard to grab onto and deal with. And so every writer practically has to reinvent the field for himself or herself. And many foreign writers or writers from other countries are also finding their voices and making themselves heard, not only in their own countries like China and Germany and Israel, other places, but also in translation in this country. And so we've gotten more understanding of the way in which science fiction has evolved, which I must admit I do not understand as much as I ought to. But it does provide a mechanism for sharing cultural ideas and thoughts and accomplishments.
Mm-hmm. Kij, we lost some of what you said. Did you want to recap anything for us?
Chris just typed it up for me, so I'm okay. I did want to just follow up what he said, that what it's like in 2020. I also had workshops for a month this summer. And we're maintaining a live chat and a just sort of a discussion group as we go forward. And people are definitely either writing a lot or writing not at all. People are using it as an escape and a support, or people are just unable to do that. And I'm finding it it's managing a difficult team of horses, because I need to be able to give both of them what they need, but what they need is really very different. Although really what everybody needs right now is just to be heard. Stop talking.
Sure. Absolutely.
Okay. Weird gap.
What have we not? Oh, I know the question I was going to ask. Given the date that we are meeting, what, if anything, does science fiction have to do with Halloween, or vice versa? Are they thematically related at all?
Yeah, well, everything is thematically related if you look at it hard enough. But science, Halloween is related, I think, through the sort of naturalization of the fantasy aspect of Halloween. It's a time when you have rituals which are involved with the invention of identities which are fantasy in origin, but can be realized in stories. And there are some Halloween stories, including one I wrote and couldn't find a market for. But if anybody is interested in a story about Halloween, why, send me an invitation.
Feel like connection is that on Halloween, it is the day of the year you are most likely to see space aliens.
And I mentioned in the chat, but I was just thinking about this because our neighborhood is going to have, probably right about now, as soon as we're done here, this parade is going to go through with children wearing costumes, walking around, and somebody in front of them in a car making sure nobody runs over the children. And we're going to throw candy at the kids as they walk past to try to be less infecting, so they don't have to wear quite as much face cover. But yeah, this is when people build costumes, when they decorate their homes, when they do all kinds of creative activities, which is really what science fiction, what speculative fiction is about, right? It's about reimagining the way things have been, are, and could be. And this way we get to actually be physically, personally a part of it. And if anything, that's like the most creative holiday we have. And it's from the point of view, especially of writing and of examining science fiction as a literature of ideas. Hard to beat.
It's also a lot of cosplay and a collision of fandoms,
Mm-hmm.
all on every doorstep. You look at all those costumes, all those trick-or-treaters.
Yep. By the way, one of the things, also the Asimov collection is part of why we're all getting together today, right? Jim Gunn is one of the world's foremost experts. This is the man who won the Hugo Award for best nonfiction work on Asimov. Jim, how did you meet Asimov? How did you get involved in working?
Well, I had become acquainted with Bob Scholes, who was a teacher at Rhode Island, a noted professor, really a scholar of contemporary or advanced theories of fiction. He had given a series of lectures at Notre Dame, which about science fiction, which had been published as an interesting book. And he and one of his former students had published a book about science fiction themselves, and on the one occasion he was here at the university to give a talk about some scholastic form of new scholastic form of writing fiction. And my wife and I had a reception for him and another famous writer who was on campus. And we got, Bob Scholes and I got talking about his plans for being the guest editor for a series of books about famous science fiction writers. And he turned to me and said, how would you like to write a book about A. Van Vogt? I know you thought in our previous book we didn't give him due credit for what he had done. And I said, well, I certainly admire Van Vogt's work, but if I have a choice, I'd rather do a book about Isaac Asimov, whom I said is a real at the heart of science fiction, particularly during the period in his heyday when he was writing the Foundation trilogy. And so I signed a contract with the academic publisher, Oxford University Press, and I knew a great deal about Isaac's work since I had known him, and I was reading everything he wrote, and practically, and I kept his science books. I couldn't bring myself to use them except when I needed it. Not that they weren't well done, but there were so many of them. But I did go back to New York, and I interviewed Isaac. He was actually at a convention there. He said, well, come along with me to another place I have to be, and we'll sit down in the lobby and you could interview me. But he said, as we started, you should be doing your own work and not wasting your time writing about me. And I said, well, everybody in the academic field has to do one of these. And so I interviewed him, and he told me a lot of things, which I eventually published in the book as an afterword. Except my battery ran out of power toward the end, and I lost some of it. But it was very, very interesting, except it was later republished, a book of essays about interviews about famous writers. And one reader wrote in and said, the one big problem with this book is it has too much of Gunn and not enough of Asimov. But I like to ask Isaac questions that demanded some explanation, because Isaac's ideas were always complex, and if you wanted a meaningful answer, you had to ask a complete sentence.
All right, well, it looks like we're at time here, right? But Jay, did you have something else that you were going to ask us?
No, it just occurs to me listening to the three of you talk that I know that that Google Earth uses Lawrence, Kansas as its center point, because I guess a KU graduate helped create the system. It occurs to me by the same token that if you were to map the science fiction universe, the center point would be Lawrence, Kansas.
Yeah,
you would think so, but we don't always have good luck in getting people to come to the center. Isaac, for instance, never could find the time to come give a talk here. He didn't like to travel, didn't fly, except upon stress. and he didn't want to take the time out of his writing schedule to take a train, so he never made it. And I asked Ursula Le Guin to come out several times. She never made it. But we have had a number of other visitors come, some of whom give the gun lecture on science fiction topics. Though it should be noted that it's named for my brother, who gave not only the endowment for the center, but also endowed a lecture fund in that in the English department that he'd helped support as a physician in Kansas City, and had come to my events on a number of occasions, mostly, and got talking to the English chairman of the English department, who spilled out his heart about the fact they had a hard time getting funds for visiting lectures. So my brother left part of his estate to help provide visiting lectures, who still do.
And the other thing, and I know we're running short on time, Stuart, so I'll be prepared to wrap up here in just a moment, but I would be remiss if I didn't say, and actually Jim and I had emailed about this about a month ago, somebody who connects West Virginia University and the University of Kansas, Gene Budig, just passed away.
Yes.
Gene was a good friend of mine, and very sorry that he's gone. But I know on a number of occasions over the years, I talked with Gene about his years as chancellor at the University of Kansas and how much he enjoyed it. He would never say that he liked KU better than WVU, but I think he did. He was there longer, that's for sure. If staying in one place is an indication, he loved Lawrence, and also Jim enjoyed knowing you, and thought highly of your work. And Gene is somebody who's been successful in so many different fields and so many different ways during his life and his career, and he thought very highly of what you and your colleagues have accomplished at KU.
Yeah, and we shared the coffee one morning, and the fact that we both had been at one time in our careers written letters for the president or chancellor of our universities, written speeches.
Yep. Yeah. So in some ways, I think Gene is probably smiling as he listens to this conversation and thinks about this bridge continuing to be built by between WVU and KU, and he was certainly the architect of that bridge in many ways.
Well, I'm smiling too.
Well, and I'm smiling because this has been such a wonderful 2.5 hours. And I'd like to thank Andrew and Kazi and Andy and Chris and Kij and Jim. Thank all of you for participating in this symposium. It's our first virtual one. Maybe we'll do more virtual and online events, but certainly we do look forward to getting back together again in person as soon as circumstances permit. But one thing I think we can say that's come out of this is that there's great broad and deep interest in promoting the use of science fiction as a scholarly resource. And the Gun Center certainly is a leader and a pioneer in that. The Eaton Collection, a very big part of making that happen. WVU looks forward to joining both of those entities in this effort. So this is just the beginning, hopefully, of a long and ongoing conversation about these topics. So I certainly appreciate everyone participating, everyone listening and attending. Stuart, is there anything else you'd like to say before we wrap up?
I'd love to echo your comments and say thank you to all our guest speakers. You have really made today special as we celebrate Asimov's 100th birthday, the WVU Asimov collection, and our founding donor, Larry Shaver, whose collection has meant so much to us over the years. Our students have so enjoyed the Asimov collection, and it is wonderful to have you here today with us. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate you taking the time to be part of this today.